Welcome to Grammar 4G. In this booklet, we're going to go over perfect form with the present tense, and then we're also going to go over to what extent adverbs, and we're going to learn how to diagram those adverbs as well. So, first, let's look at perfect form. Last time we talked about past perfect. This time we're talking about present perfect. So once again, perfect form is just used to clarify the order of past events. When we get to present perfect, we're essentially saying that the action began in the past and is still happening, or that action has recently completed, but we're not exactly sure when it was. So it's slightly different and a more general form of perfect to use with verbs. To create present perfect, we still use the simple tenses of to have, but of course this time we're going to focus in on present tense of to have. And then of course we will alter or conjugate the main verb into the perfect form. Last time we focused on regular verbs and how we will use the past tense and a way to identify the perfect form. So in this one, what we want to do is we want to show you the relationship between the past tense and the perfect form, because now we're going to start getting into irregular verbs. So we'll just start with the first rule. And like I said, it's not actually a rule, it's more of a pattern, just to try and help you to remember how to spell some of the perfect forms, because it can be a lot and everything can be very different, whereas progressive, it was pretty straightforward. So let's just start with the first one. We have using the past tense, change the A to a U. So our example verb is to sing. The past tense of sing is sang. But to make the perfect form, we transfer that A to a U, so it becomes sung. Shelley has sung in the choir every year. So next we're going to get into using the past tense, add an in. To speak, and past tense is spoke. To make the perfect form, you make spoken. Have they spoken to her? So notice that with to sing, the A and the U, that's going to be a common theme with words that end in NG and verbs that end in NG, that is. Whereas this one can be a little bit more specific to certain types of verbs. The next one is very similar. When we use the past tense, we're going to double the consonant and then add en. So to get in past tense is got, and perfect form it is gotten. Mom has gotten apples from the grocer. And the last one we're going to go over is using the past tense. We're going to change the E to an O and add an N. So to fly, and past tense is flew. In perfect form, it's flown. The children have flown over the Gulf on their trip. So like it's a lot of patterns, and it's very different from progressive or even the previous booklet for F, where we just had regular verbs. So be sure to use the reference page in the back for a full list of all the perfect forms that are going to be used in this book. They are patterns, and so right now they may look really random all next to each other, but once you look at that reference page, you'll start to see what patterns that we're talking about. Also notice that outside of the perfect form being correctly conjugated, you also need to make sure you use the appropriate form of to have so that it agrees with the subject. Obviously, past perfect, we use had as our helping verb, so that's pretty straightforward. But with present perfect, we have has or have as our possible helping verb. So just make sure you're using the right helping verb and the right perfect form. So just watch out for that, and always use the reference page as much as you can remember. Next, we're going to go over to what extent adverbs. And this is just kind of a name that we've given it. It's not really a technical name for these type of adverbs, because although you've learned adverbs are words that describe the verb or the action of the sentence, in fact, adverbs are more than that. They can also describe another adverb. So really, we're just calling them to what extent adverbs, but they're just adverbs. So let's look at some examples of the to what extent adverbs. So far, we've already introduced some to you in the previous book. Words like more, most, less, least, and it's kind of modifying to what extent the adverb is describing the verb or action. Other ones we'll use in this book are rather, to, very, so, quite, somewhat, and as. So these are gonna be the only ones that we use in this booklet, but of course there are plenty of other types of to what extent adverbs that we're not covering in this booklet. So now let's look at an example of how you're going to identify these in a sentence so you understand the relationship of these to what extent adverbs to the rest of the words in a sentence. Here we have an example sentence. It says, mother relatively quickly makes dinner. So let's just start with the basics. Let's find our subject and let's find our verb. So we have mother as our subject, and what is she doing? She's making dinner. So what is describing the action of to make? Well, quickly, it's telling you how she is making dinner. And then we have the word relatively. Relatively is not describing the action of the sentence. Instead, it's describing to what extent and to what extent how she's making dinner. So it's not just quickly, it's relatively quickly. You could also say mother very quickly makes dinner. Mother rather quickly makes dinner. That kind of stuff. So just watch out to make sure that you have your arrows pointing to the right words and really identifying those relationships between the words in the sentence. Now we're going to go over the sentence diagramming for the to what extent adverbs. Let's look at our sentence. We have Kavita has very nicely given a surprise. So once again, we're going to start with the basics. We're going to find our subject and our verb and all the other stuff that's going to go on our baseline. So we have our subject, Kavita. She has given, that's the verb phrase, and we have a direct object because surprise is receiving the action of being given. So before we get to surprise, we use a as our adjective, a surprise, and now we have very nicely left. So once again, we have nicely as just our regular adverb that we've known so far in this series and in Grammar 3. So nicely is describing given. However, very is describing nicely, not given. So it's modifying the adverb, not the verb. So now we will get into the actual diagramming of this. We start with our baseline and we're bisecting it with our subject and predicate, and then we also make a nice little horizontal line for the direct object. We have a describing word for a direct object, and we also have a describing word for the verb, so we make our nice diagonal lines. But we also have very, and once again, as I've already said multiple times, it is describing the adverb. So we don't make a second diagonal line connected to the predicate. Instead, we draw a nice little ladder type thing, a little rung, and we are going to connect our second adverb diagonal line to the actual adverb that is describing the verb. So now let's see how this plays out with the actual words. We've got our subject and our verb and our direct object. And of course, we've got the super easy adjective that describes the direct object. So now we can fill in the very nicely. So we put nicely on this first line because it's describing the verb, whereas very goes onto the rung of the adverb ladder. So that way we can see that very is describing nicely, which is describing the verb. When you diagram this, obviously you won't have to draw your own lines, but it is important to make those very distinct once you do start diagramming by yourself. And it's also very important for you to realize that the order of where you write the adverbs is very important because very is describing nicely. If you write them on the opposite lines, that's not going to make sense according to this sentence. So just be very aware of how you are showing the relationship between these words and the sentence. And that will be how you diagram to what extent adverbs. If you have any questions over this or anything else in Grammar 4, please contact the owner of your center or whoever grades your grammar.